This is a table later I made for my friend Christian. I started out with some purple heart and some zebra wood. I didn't really have a great idea what I was doing, but I knew I needed to cut down the purple heart so it would fit on my joiner. Cut it to about 6 inches square and got one face and one edge flat, and then took it over to the table saw to cross cut it. I want to get the other face parallel, so I use the old blue tape super glue planer sled trick to not get any snipe as I send this through my planer. The eagle-eyed among you may notice that I have forgotten the blue tape. This made it essentially impossible to remove the purple heart from this piece of melamine. I tried a lot of banging and hammering and cursing, and ultimately I pulled a whole bunch of the particle board out of the melamine. In retrospect, I probably could have just sent this right back through the planer in another sled, but I wasn't feeling so hot on planer sleds, so I clamped it up in one of these wooden screw clamps and sort of created an inverted milling machine on my router table to remove the detritus there. This worked reasonably well. I think I did lose a little bit of parallelism there because this wasn't perfect, and I did take another pass on the joiner. You typically don't want to take two opposing faces on the joiner because there's no guarantee that they're going to be parallel. So I then started cutting the dado for the zebra wood, and I made sure that this dado was perfectly symmetrical by going from one direction and then flipping it back around so that I was essentially exactly the same distance from either edge. I then clamped up a couple of pieces of zebra wood to make one larger piece of zebra wood, and then milled one face and one edge flat and perpendicular. And this time I remembered the blue tape for my planer sled. These planer sleds work really well when you're dealing with scrap or cut off wood. You typically don't need to do this type of thing when you're working with larger pieces. But I buy most of my exotic wood as scraps from the exotic lumber distributor. They send me, really heavy boxes that are just full of cutoffs, and they're great for projects like this. I would estimate that the wood for this project cost somewhere in the range of $8 when you consider, by weight, how much, what percentage of the box this was. So for the third planer sled, I'm not actually gluing down the workpiece. I'm putting a couple of finish nails behind it so that I can take it out of the sled and test its fit in the dado each time and sneak up on that perfect fit. And I did indeed get that perfect fit I was looking for. Fits very snugly. Now I can finally switch over to a cross-cutting blade and a zero clearance fence, whatever that thing is called, not a fence, a saw insert? Zero clearance insert, that's what I'm looking for. And I'll use my Incra miter gauge to dial in the exact width for this piece. and fitting it together, it is spot on. So I'll glue it up using way too much glue. And I'll spend the next 10 minutes in a panic with wet rags trying to remove all of the squeeze out. I do want to make sure I get a really good glue up here though, because we're going to be milling away through the zebra wood and exposing some of the purple heart underneath. And I really don't want to see any kind of imperfection in the glue line. So I'm going to use 3 of these really big parallel clamps, and I'm really cranking down on these guys to make sure I've got adequate clamping pressure across the whole joint and a really nice thin glue line. So planer sled number 4, we're going to send this guy through to reduce the height of that big old chunk of zebra wood. And just bit by bit, hogging it away until it comes down to the measurement that I have figured out in a CAD model. That's looking better. So now I'll lay out the location for the hole where the lighter insert is going to go. I measure across and find the diagonals to get the center of that square, and then I'll use an automatic center punch to give myself a little place for the Forstner bit to grab onto. This is a pretty big hole, so I'm going to set this up in a vise that I will bolt to my drill press table with some carriage bolts. And this way everything's locked down nicely and I can concentrate on just steadily feeding and making sure that my bit doesn't get clogged up with these chips. Looks really cool when the transition occurs. I love seeing the purple heart come out like that. Very neat. But we got a nice clean hole. So now I can start trying to remove some of the excess zebra wood. We want that sort of concave to convex transition, but I'll use this really big, I guess you call it a combination cutter, in order to just hog out most of the waste. We're going to have to switch over to a cutter with a rounded end to get that concavity. And I'll get right up to the purple heart, as close as I dare, before switching over to that rounded cutter. And now I'll just take little bites until I get right up to my line. Now I did raise the bit just a bit too high here, and as I move the piece over, it's actually digging in a little bit at the very tip and creating these big horizontal lines that I'm going to have to sand out later. A little bit unfortunate, but this project had a lot of sanding, so that's just a little piece of it. So I'm going to set up this bit with the bearing in place so that I can get my fence registered, but then I'm actually going to remove it. And you'll see that with the bearing in place, it actually wouldn't fit underneath this purple heart surface. So it's an interesting trick with the Incra fence, because you can do things like that, you know, move the fence and bring it back to exactly where it was. And since I have 4 surfaces of this zebra wood that I need to put a heavy round over onto, I can just determine what the measurements are from my drawing and move the fence to those positions. And since I zeroed the fence on the bearing, it'll give me the right location every time. So you can see here, the fence is now set to the offset between the zero of the bearing and the edge of the Purple Heart. And this allows me to just move the fence in small increments, taking little bites off of this big roundover until I get right to my mark. So at this point, I need to sand some of these lines and gouges out. And I'll start with a card scraper. And this works pretty well. Got to be careful because I don't want to dig into the little edge where the concave portion of the zebra wood meets up with the Purple Heart. That would be bad. I want that to remain sharp. So I'll come in with various tools. This is a card scraper shaped like a curve, and this works okay. I've got this deep gouge there where the interface between the, I guess you call it a bullnose router bit and the roundover bit started. I switched my 0 in between, so it's off by just a hair. So I'll come in with some sandpaper here wrapped around a rubber form, and it's a pretty deep scratch, as you can see from this angle here. I kind of am just trying everything in my shop that's round at this point. This actually ended up working probably the best. It's a scraper for the lathe. Actually, it's a lathe tool, and this one worked pretty well. I had to keep working at it for a long time, but it did eventually remove that scratch. And I can switch back to some sandpaper, this 120 grit, and I'm really trying to maintain the curves here. I want the radius of the concave and the convex sections to be the same, so it would have been pretty easy to sand a little bit too far and ruin that feature. I'll finish up the chamfer here because I couldn't get to it on the router table. Gotta get that last little bit. But I don't want to dig into zebra wood. So come at it from both sides until that little piece is released. There we go. So now I'm going to start cutting the little tray that's kind of inset there. So I cut these pieces of wood to very close to 1 inch, just a few thousandths over, and I'm going to use that as support. So I'll find the 0 on my cutter here, and I'll raise it up at 1 inch and a little bit, and I'll start cutting my dish. I've got stops on the left and the right that I can move to, and you can see we're starting by moving the fence back and forth to cut out the dish. So in between, I can raise the bit up by some amount, and you can see that blue tape there is my 0, so every rotation there is 1/16 of an inch. So now I can carefully drop it down, move to the right, and move to the left, and I'm slowly but surely milling away that tray. It's very important to keep the edge of the Purple Heart registered very squarely against the face as you drop it down. You wouldn't want to have that off kilter, or you would end up destroying the crisp edge of the little tray. Similarly, when you raise it up, you got to be careful to be raising it vertically with the edge firmly registered against the fence. This is fairly slow going, but as long as you follow the correct sequence, you end up with a pretty good result. And we've finally broken through to the Purple Heart. Boy, does that look cool. This is sped up now, I believe 12 times as fast as reality, just to get an idea of how the sequence goes. So we're left with these little ridges, and I will take a little piece of that sandpaper form tool to just get in there and do my best to follow the grain, but make sure I'm removing all of the lines that are left over from that bit. I really shouldn't have done this, but I took the orbital sander and hit the sides. The feet that I'm planning on using are a square or rectangular profile that are inset into the base. And because they're very square, any slight non-squareness of the workpiece is very obvious. And even though I do have a hard pad on my sander, I did introduce a little bit of convexity to the sides, and it really kind of made the feet stick out, and it doesn't look super great. If I was gonna do this again, I would find a way to make sure that that was gonna be very flat. Back to the router table, and I am now milling the recesses for those feet, and of course I did not scribe the lines, so I ended up with some tear out. I talked with Christian, and we decided that filling in the edges here with a little trim piece of ebony would be a nice touch, and it would cover up the mistake. So I use my marking gauge to cut a nice deep line to avoid the tear out that I just got. And back to the router table to mill away those recesses. I took a scrap of ebony to my what is this thing called? It's a saw. Scroll saw, that's what I'm looking for. And I'm using the scroll saw because the kerf of the blade is very small. And I don't have a lot of ebony, and I didn't want to waste it, so I just went with, whatever would help me waste the least amount. And at this point, I need to get a exact length on these pieces of ebony, so I am installing the brass feet. I'm using a VIX bit, a self-centering drill bit. The brand VIX is a pretty high quality version of this. There are a lot of companies that make them, but I've tried a few, and the VIX ones are the ones that I continue to come back to. I'm using a little bit of wax on the screw as I cut the threads with the steel screw, and I'm going to drive that in, holding the foot in place, and then I will drill the other hole. very important to cut the threads for brass screws before installing them, or else you risk shearing off the threaded portion inside of your workpiece, and that is really no fun to dig out. So once all the feet are installed, I can use a variety of tools to get an exact length on these guys. This is a miniature disc sander, which works really well for these small pieces. And I can get a nice exact length and tape it in place so that I know which one goes where. And here you can see sort of the whole process of fitting one of these pieces. I think this one actually overshot a little bit, but the one on the left is a little smaller anyway, so still ended up with a perfect fit. So to get these approximately to height, I clamp up my block plane and I have a scribe line there, and I'm just going to plane down to the scribe line. And I'm not going all the way. I don't want this to be a perfect fit because I really want to sand this after it's glued to get to the exact flush that I'm looking for. But this is just going to remove a lot of the excess. And here's how I mark the line with a very flat chisel. I'm going to glue these on with hide glue. I like hide glue a lot. It's reversible. It's really easy to clean up because it's water soluble. So you can really just slather it on. It's hard to use too much hide glue. And once your piece is glued up, a rag soaked with hot water will easily remove any of the spill out. Still wintertime when I was doing this, so the shop is pretty cold. So I'm preheating my joints with a heat gun before applying the glue. And this helps it to not set up right away so that I can make sure I get a really good bond here. And I'm really just flooding the joint. I want there to be plenty of glue. Whoop. Clamp it up a little better. I'm going to use blue tape as a clamp for these guys because I want to make sure I'm getting my clamping force in both axes here. I don't want to have a really tight clamping force towards the top of the piece, but not towards the other side. So you can see there, I really just put a whole bunch of blue tape on it, and I stretch that pretty taut as I'm applying it. And for something like this, that is going to be more than enough. If you haven't tried hide glue, I would recommend it. You can get started with just a simple double boiler over a flame, or you could probably even microwave it. I've never tried that, but you mix up a batch and it'll last a really good long time in the fridge. I've tried this grain filler exactly once before, and I didn't have great results with it, but I have done a lot of reading online, and it seems like the secret is to get it as a very, very thin layer by scraping across the grain with something hard and flat like a credit card. So I'm doing my best to, get the pores and the grain filled up um, while not leaving too much excess. So after the first coat of this, you can see it dried pretty, I don't know, almost crystalline. It definitely had a buildup on the surface of the wood, and it took just an absolute lot of sanding to kind of bring it down to bare wood. And I think I did 2 or 3 coats of this, basically until my fingernail wasn't catching the grain on the long grain areas of the Purple Heart. I never got 100% of the grain filled with this stuff. It just didn't seem like it was going to happen. So I did rely on the finish later to kind of fill in some of that. I did more coats than I normally would in order to get a really nice smooth to the touch feel here. The one mistake I did make was in the areas where I didn't sand well enough. When I applied my first coat of finish, you could tell where there were areas of this pore filler still on the surface, and the stain, not the stain, but the finish just couldn't penetrate it. And it looked like splotches of unfinished area. So, I was able to just sand through the entire coat of finish and recover it. It looks fine in the end. But yeah, my advice for this stuff is to maybe not use it, but if you are going to use it, make sure you really sand it well, because if you don't, you may end up spoiling your finish, and you have to go back and sand more anyway. This little epoxy stirring stick worked really well for scraping in those concave areas. So finally, time to start applying finish. I used my vacuum to try and remove as much dust from the piece and the area as I could, and I put together a little pad for applying the finish. This is just an old cotton t-shirt, and inside of the t-shirt you put some cotton balls. I've made these pads with a linen exterior in the past, and that works really well. I couldn't find any linen. I have some somewhere, but it's lost in the shop. The padding is really nice for a lot of these type of wipe-on finishes. I don't usually use it for the last coat, but it's a nice way to do your builds. So you just kind of soak the cotton balls pretty well, so you have a nice reservoir of finish inside, and then you can apply your finish. I really love Armor Seal. It's probably my favorite finish. It's a great mix of durability and just beauty. It looks really nice. I haven't found a piece of wood that it doesn't improve. I think I did 5 coats, sanding in between with gray Scotch Brite. The sleeve here just kind of pushes right in, and it's complete. I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I enjoyed making it. Until next time.